afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our discussion of how FAFSA is not enough. This afternoon's webinar will be about how verification keeps students from entering college. For those of you who do not know me, and I know we have a lot of new folks on the webinar today who are new to FCAN, so welcome. I am Amy Bolick, FCAN's Community Engagement and Programs Manager. You can email me there at my email address or tweet at me on Twitter. We also have a wonderful panel of speakers today from National College Access Network. We have Morley Keller, who is the Director of Technical Assistance, who will be talking about strategies for assisting students through the verification process. Jack Porter, the Advocacy Associate, who will summarize NCAN and FCAN's priorities around advocating for a simpler FAFSA completion and verification process. And Bill DeBon, the Director of Data and Evaluation, who will share about research NCAN has done recently that's really done a lot of good work to shed light on the problem of FAFSA verification and low-income students. Before we get started, I just want to talk about a couple of housekeeping items. First, we welcome your questions. So throughout the webinar, please use the questions box to type in anything that you want to know more about from me or any of the other presenters. And we'll have some time at the end of the webinar to address those. Also, we welcome you to share on social media about today's webinar. You can tweet at Florida College Access Network at FL College Access, and you can tweet at NCAN at College Access or at Form Your Future, which is their FAFSA initiative. And the hashtags you can use are hashtag FCAN, hashtag FAFSA Challenge, hashtag Form Your Future, and hashtag FAFSA. Again, for those of you who are new to Florida College Access Network, we are a statewide organization whose mission is to catalyze and support communities to improve college and career readiness, access, and completion for all students. And our vision is that at least 60% of working age Floridians will have a high quality post-secondary degree or credential by the year 2025. And in that post-secondary degree or credential, we're including bachelor's degrees, associate's degrees, workforce certificates, any kind of post-high school credential that prepares students for a good job. At FCAN, we accomplish our work in three main ways. The first is through local college access networks, or LCANs. We have LCANs covering about 80% of the state's population, and these are place-based coalitions that bring together different groups in a certain area that are all committed to improving post-secondary access. So education institutions, businesses, nonprofits will all come to the same table and share goals and common strategies. We also focus on research and policy, and we'll be sharing some research today from our research and data team around FAFSA completion. And finally, we have statewide initiatives, which are campaigns that help advance the goal of making sure that all students apply to college, access financial aid, and make plans for life after high school. And so that's our application week event, our FAFSA challenge, and our decision day events, as well as Planet Florida, which is a new initiative we're working on that focuses on early readiness. So if you are a school counselor or an LCAN member or a community member in the state of Florida and you want to register your school or organization for the initiatives, make sure to do that at floridacollegeaccess.org/initiatives. And I just want to really quick mention the FAFSA Challenge, which is a big part of the way that we focus on FAFSA in the state of Florida. And in the FAFSA Challenge, we encourage schools and community organizations that register to take on the goal of improving FAFSA completion by 5% over the previous year. And last year, we had almost 300 schools take on that goal, and over 100 schools meet that goal. So we're very proud of the work that the FAFSA Challenge has done to get folks excited about FAFSA. Before I get started going into FAFSA getting too much in the weeds, I want to take a couple of seconds to learn more about the audience that we have here. So I'm going to ask a couple of poll questions. So the first one I would like to ask is, how would you rate your level of FAFSA knowledge? All right, so I want to know, do you know a good deal about FAFSA, a moderate amount, a little, or almost none? Going to give you a couple more seconds to complete that. Okay, I'm going to close that out. And so most of us have a moderate amount of FAFSA knowledge. There's some of us here with a good deal, which is great. Those 22% of you that know a little or almost nothing, that's also great. We're happy to have you here today to learn some more. And now I would like to move on to the next poll question. Bear with me just a second. Okay. Hide. Okay. So our specific topic today is about FAFSA verification. So the same question, how would you rate your level of knowledge about FAFSA verification? Do you know a good deal, a moderate amount, a little, or almost nothing? Give you guys a couple more seconds to answer this. Okay, so this is great to see because even though most of us here today have at least some knowledge of FAFSA, of much higher, more than half of us rate our knowledge of FAFSA verification at either a little or almost none. So that's really great. I'm glad to have you all on today to learn more about verification. And then the last thing I want to know is, have you worked directly with students on the issue of verification? Yes, no, or you don't do direct service with students? Just to get a better idea of who we have with us today. All right. So it looks like most of us are direct service providers, and most of us who are direct service providers have worked with students on verification. A few haven't. And for those of you who don't work directly with students, I'm glad that you're on today to be able to get this information as well. So that's awesome. Whatever level of FAFSA knowledge you consider yourself at, FCAN has great resources to help you with that. You can go to floridacollegeaccess.org/initiative/Florida FAFSA Challenge to find a lot of our resources. I also want to take a minute to plug Future Makers Coalition, which is one of our partners down in Southwest Florida. They have a great webpage called FAFSA First, where they have a lot of one-pagers and FAQs and handouts that you can use. And then I also have a couple of things attached in the handout section here. So I have the FAFSA Challenge Toolkit, which is currently the 2017-18 version. The 2018-19 version will be out before October 1st when FAFSA launches, but last year's toolkit still has a lot of relevant information in it. I have a handout that my colleague Kimberly, who is our senior research associate, and I made on the top FAFSA mistakes students make. And then we have a verification handout from our partners down in Collier County that goes over some of the steps to make sure that you take with students who are working on verification. Finally, if you go to our initiatives page, you'll find the FAFSA Challenge dashboard, where we use data from the U.S. Department of Education and enrollment data from the Florida Department of Education to calculate FAFSA completion rates and update those in near real time throughout the FAFSA Challenge. And we also do some FAFSA story blog posts that you can find on our blog, where we talk to partners throughout the state who are doing great work to try to improve FAFSA completion in their areas, to find out about the strategies that they're using. I know that we have folks on today from all throughout the country, but I want to take a couple minutes to talk about FAFSA in Florida and some of our FAFSA data, because FAFSA is really important to us in Florida, and our FAFSA data has been a big driver behind why this has become a key issue for our communities. So according to the most recent data, Florida ranks number 3 in the nation for the number of students who qualify for a Pell Grant, which is free money that low-income students can get to attend college. But we rank 31st out of 50 states in DC in the number of students completing the FAFSA. So we have a big gap between the number of students who qualify for a Pell Grant and the number of those students who are completing the FAFSA to get access to that Pell Grant. And by June 30th of 2018, fewer than half of Florida students completed the FAFSA, even though a much bigger number than that were eligible for free money to attend college. Now, we did move up in our rank in FAFSA completion since last year. Before we were at 36 and we moved up to 31. So we are making progress. The work that our communities are doing is moving the needle, but we still have a long way to go in making sure that we're helping all of our students access the money they need for college. Which also brings us to the title of today's webinar, which is that FAFSA is not enough. Our communities are really focused on working together to improve FAFSA completion, but that's not the last step for students in accessing financial aid. It's only the first step. So first of all, in Florida, nearly 10% of the FAFSAs that were submitted last year were either incomplete or incorrect, which means that Florida was the 4th highest in the nation for FAFSA errors compared to 50 states and DC. And if every submitted FAFSA in Florida had been completed or completely correct, we would have actually exceeded our 5% goal last year. So our partners are doing a very good job of making sure that they're working with kids and getting them and their parents to help them fill out the FAFSA. The problem is that some of the complications with this form are making it difficult for students to get all the way through the process. And then even for students who do get all the way through the process and they submit a complete and correct FAFSA, 30% of all of those FAFSA filers are being selected for verification. And for low income filers, as many as 50% are being selected. And data shows us that last year, as many as 75% of low income filers in some areas were being selected for verification, which is the issue that we're really going to focus on today. So since most of us have little or no knowledge of FAFSA verification, I want to take some time to go over exactly what that is. So that verification is a randomly selected federal audit to ensure the accuracy of the information listed on the FAFSA or the free application for federal student aid. So just like when you submit your taxes, there's a chance that you'll be audited by the federal government to make sure that everything you said on there was true. When a student submits a FAFSA, there's a chance that they'll be selected for the same reason. The difference is that tax filers are audited at about 2%, where FAFSA filers, again, are audited more, anywhere from 30 to 75%, depending. Students have to work with each school individually to complete verification. And so sometimes students get confused about this, and Morley will be talking about this in more detail, but students have to work with the institution they applied to submit the verification documents to verify their income, not with the federal student aid. And so if they applied to 3 schools and they want to get financial aid letters from all of them, they need to verify their income with all 3 of those schools. And students will know if they were selected for verification because they will have an asterisk next to their expected family contribution number that they receive on their student aid report. So after a student completes the FAFSA, they'll get a student aid report that has an expected family contribution number that tells them how much the government thinks that their family can afford to contribute based on their family's income. If that number has an asterisk next to it, that means that that student has been selected for verification and that they will need to go through this extra process. And we won't be talking about this today, but I do also want to mention that if the student is selected to verify their citizenship, they will have a C next to that number. And sometimes a student will have both a C and an asterisk next to that number, meaning that they're being asked to verify both their citizenship and their income. So on that note, I'm going to hand things over to our friends at NCAN in just a minute so that they can get started. Okay. Morley, I'll hand it over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Amy. Welcome, everyone. This is Morley Keller. I'm the Director of Technical Assistance at the National College Access Network. Thank you for joining us today on the webinar. We are excited to have been invited to talk about this topic with all of you. The first area I'm going to address are some of the verification challenges that, programs that are assisting our students, have seen, in particular, some of these reference, verification for the long run, but also some of the verification issues or challenges that have cropped up within the last couple years. The most recent year for our students who filed last year starting October 1, there was a very high percentage of low-income students who were selected for verification when filing their FAFSA, and that includes students who did and did not use the DRT when filing the FAFSA. It is our understanding that there were some algorithms that the Department Federal Student Aid, the Department of Education adjusted in late December, which began to slow down the percentage of our low-income students who were selected for verification. But, Amy shared some numbers that programs saw 50 to 75% of their low-income students being selected for verification, which has presented sort of a long-term challenge, in terms of getting that high volume of students through verification during the academic year. One of the things that we're hearing from some of our member programs this summer is, and now it probably falls under the umbrella of summer melt or verification melt, but, we've got programs that are still dealing with students who were selected for verification last fall and still trying to get verification resolved so that their aid will be available for their fall term enrollment. So that has presented a tremendous challenge this past year for a lot of our programs and a lot of students around the country. Once a student is selected, and if they're required to provide copies of the parent and/or student tax transcripts, the methods for accessing the tax transcripts on the IRS website have been a challenge. There have been times when downloading online transcripts was not available. That system was shut off for a while, but the general criteria to be able to use the online opportunity to download the tax transcripts requires the person to have several methods of, in a sense, authentication to be able to use that, things like credit card numbers or mortgage numbers, etc. And many of our low-income students do not meet the criteria to be able to download their tax transcripts online. So often our students are in the process of requesting them and or completing the paper form 4506T and mailing in their transcript request and waiting on mailed copies of tax transcripts to come back so that they can get them submitted to their institutions. There's also the issue of non-filing letters and verifying non-filing with the IRS. In the previous year, one who indicated they did not file a tax return, dependent students, independent students, or parents, were all required to go get a verification form from the IRS regarding to document the fact that they did not file an IRS form. For this current year, there was some relief in that requirement was removed for all dependent students. However, independent students and parents who indicate that they're non-filers still need to secure the non-filing letter from the IRS as part of verification. Dependent students probably have an opportunity to check a box on institutional verification form indicating that they were not required to file. So there has been some relief this year, but still getting those verification of non-filing letters has been a challenge. The other thing that many of our programs and families find a challenge is that colleges choose to notify students regarding their selection for verification and what the process is in varied methods. Colleges may send emails, colleges may post notices up on websites or in portals, letting students know that they're selected and telling them what the process is, and it may be going to website and downloading documents or uploading documents to systems to complete verification. And so first of all, it's difficult because students may be notified in various ways by colleges, and then the actual process for submitting documents and turning things in varies from college to college. So there is not a uniform method for students to know that this is exactly what I would do. I can do it 5 times if I've been accepted at 5 colleges. So that creates a challenge, and it's a challenge for our programs. They probably become familiar with institutions that are in their backyard about what the process is and how they can help a student through it. But our students apply everywhere around the country and go to school everywhere around the country. So it's just really not possible to know every notification method or process used by the colleges. The great news is that people like you who are on the webinar today are in many cases people in positions where you can assist students. You're direct service providers, and so you're working with your students, and if they're selected for verification, the good news is that you might be there to help them through this process. Reality, however, tells us that there are not a lot of access programs around the country. There's not one for every school district, and not every student has access to a knowledgeable person who can assist them through the verification process. And that is unfortunate and will cause a lot of students who have questions and can't seem to get any assistance or answers. It will hang students up in the verification process, and they never may reach the point of receiving an award letter or having aid in their account to be ready to pay for school. So Amy, the next slide. So I want to talk just a little bit about, strategies to help combat verification if your program is one that can assist students through this process. Number one, first and foremost, we need to track which of the students that you're serving have completed the FAFSA. The great news about Florida and the Florida FAFSA challenge, et cetera, and this is true in a lot of other states, there's a lot of tracking going on at the student. A lot of folks have access to student level data to know exactly who has started or completed a FAFSA. And so that's going to be the first key step is, do you know which of the students you serve have completed? Because there's your potential pool for who might be selected for verification. We have seen some strategies where programs, as they offer FAFSA completion workshops, so they may be assisting the families in completing their FAFSA online at a workshop format, make it an included part of that FAFSA completion workshop to help assist families with ordering tax transcripts before they even leave the FAFSA workshop. So that could be helpful. We know high percentages of low-income students are selected. Obviously, there may be some families that go get tax transcripts that do not end up selected for verification, but it's great for those that are, if they have gone through the process, have the tax transcripts ordered and on their way, so that if they are selected for verification, they're ready to begin the verification process as quickly as possible. We will do a reminder about using the DRT, using the DRT, using the DRT. While using the DRT to transfer financial information from the IRS is not a guarantee that you won't be selected for verification, it certainly reduces the chance that you'll be selected for verification. So, many of our programs, we strongly encourage, whenever possible, to use the DRT to help reduce the potential verification percentage. Many of our programs, require or ask their students to bring their student aid report in to the access advisors or to program personnel so that they can review the student aid report to make sure that the student is very clear. There could be other messages beyond being selected for verification on the student aid report. So if there are issues to be addressed, it's great when a student has an opportunity to bring those to an access advisor and have that SAR reviewed, and in particular discuss, if they are selected for verification, if that asterisk is on the front page of the student aid report next to the EFC. And again, if you have tracking capabilities and you're tracking who completes the FAFSA, and if you get a chance to review those student aid reports, can you track in your system or make an indication of who was selected for verification so that you can continue to keep an eye on those students and make sure that they are completing the process at all the colleges where they have been accepted. Next slide, Amy.
So before I jump to the next slide, I have a couple of questions that came in that I want
Okay.
to address real quick. A couple of people asked what the DRT stands for. That's
Oh,
the IRS data retrieval tool.
correct.
Marley, you want to add anything about that?
Yeah, yeah. Just for those of you that may not be familiar, it's been several years, but families have had the ability, um, if they filed taxes, and those that do married filing separately are not able to use the DRT, but many other categories of families, married filing jointly or individual student tax returns, they have the ability to, while they're completing the FAFSA, transfer over to the IRS system and have the IRS information directly loaded into the FAFSA, and as long as they make no changes, that becomes, in a sense, verified information because it was put in the FAFSA from the IRS system. So that's what the data retrieval tool DRT refers to.
That's great. And then we have a great question from one of our folks from a school district who works with financial aid. And she asked whether there's a way to know that students who've been selected for verification, their school receives the student level data. And unfortunately, right now, the only way for a service provider to know whether a student has been selected for verification is to see that student aid report and to see whether there's an asterisk next to that number. So that's why, as Morley was talking about, some organizations that do work with FAFSA completion have been adding a step where they ask those students to bring in those student aid reports so that they can look at them and see whether that student's been selected for verification. And then real quick, go ahead, Morley.
I was just going to say there are it's a limited number of practices, but some of the states that do provide student level data, in the reports that they make available to the school districts, it includes the information that the FAFSA was submitted, that the FAFSA was completed, and a very limited number of people include a third field that does tell whether the student was selected for verification or not. But it's a very limited number who do that. So most people simply see submitted and completed, and so many times in reviewing the student aid reports, the only way to discover if the student was selected.
That's great information, Morley, and I can tell our folks in Florida that we only have the submitted and completed fields. So I'm gonna leave the rest of the questions till the end for now, but since those were pretty pertinent to these slides, I wanted to make sure.
Great, thank you. Oh, some additional ways to help combat the verification issues or challenges for your students is perhaps you could keep a tracking document at your program of how colleges notify students regarding verification. So understanding where it's colleges that actually will email students to notify them. There are some colleges that still do actual postal mailings to students, and they'll mail the verification form and the requirements. You know, does the institution post it online for the student in sort of the portal that the student may have access to, once they've built a username and password after they've been accepted to the institution? So, certainly understanding, the colleges in your backyard or perhaps the most popular colleges in your particular state and what that process is may be really helpful. If a student walks in and says, I've been selected for verification and I don't know what to do, and you ask, where have you applied? And if you know, and have some information about the processes for some of those more popular colleges, you may be able to jump right in and help the student. Whenever possible, a great way to help students is to review the verification materials before they're submitted. So if you tell a student that if they want to gather all the documentation and if there is a verification worksheet that has to be completed, if they bring that in, and if you're in the direct service position, for you to review all the materials to make sure things are signed, because one of the things that can hang a student up in the verification process is they submit their documentation, but there's a form missing. And so then the back and forth communication begins between the student and the institution about what was missing, or did a verification worksheet, is it missing a signature? And so whenever possible, if you can review the materials before they're submitted or uploaded, that always will be helpful and probably cut down on the chances that the student did not submit all the required materials, and make sure that all the signatures were in place. One of the other ways to help verify whether a student probably got through the verification process is if your organization does, for any reason, collect or review award letters. In many cases, when you see an award letter from a student, the process for many institutions is to receive the FAFSA, notify the student that they were selected for verification, wait to collect the verification materials, review them, and if the student successfully makes it through verification, then send an award letter. There are some colleges that still have a process of sending out tentative award letters. And that may be that they want to get the offers out in the student's hands as quickly as possible. And there's probably going to be language on the award letter somewhere that that this is a tentative award letter and will be finalized, maybe once all requested documents have been provided. So reviewing those. The other thing we thought, and if you want to type those in for Amy, and perhaps we can share them at the end, if there are other strategies that your programs are using to help combat the verification issue, we would love to hear those, and we would love to share them with the group today. So that brings an end to my slides. And so I'm going to turn it over to my
All
colleague.
right. Thank you so much, Morley. We're going to have Jack next. So Jack, go ahead if you are ready.
All right, thanks, Amy. Thanks, Morley. As Amy said, my name is Jack Porter. I'm an advocacy associate here at NCAN. So happy to talk through some of the ways that we're thinking about this from a policy and advocacy perspective. That is, how can we, advocate for a fix in policy to kind of reduce the burden on our programs and as well as our students. So I guess what I would say is the first step in this process is to educate, yourself on the origination of, and that is to say, how did we get here to the point where so many of our low-income students are being burdened by this process? And so it's helpful to educate yourself, and then also be in a position to educate, a policymaker who might be across the table from you, who more than likely is not a FAFSA expert or a FAFSA verification expert. They're more likely than handling more than one policy issue. So it can be kind of a good way to kind of get a lay of the land or give them a lay of the land before you go ahead and dive in. And so kind of under that umbrella, you have, the origination is that in 2010, the Improper Payments Elimination and Recovery Act was signed. And what that did was it amended the 2002 version of that same law, as well as it amending some Office of Management and Budget guidance. And so in short, the impact that law and that OMB guidance has on FAFSA verification is that now if a federal program spends more than $100 million, which the Pell Grant program does, it spends about $30 billion annually, and has an improper payment rate of more than 2.5%, it's deemed at risk. And so there has to be this verification process. And in fiscal year 2011, of course, I said, it well exceeded $100 million, but the improper payment rate in fiscal year 2011 was 2.7%. And so that's kind of how we got here. A second thing that I would mention is that starting in 2012, or I should say before 2012, the Department of Ed had a cap on how many FAFSAs could be verified, and that's 30% of the entire pool. And then in 2012, after the fiscal year 2011, which saw 2.7% improper payment rate, that cap was lifted. So now, in theory, every FAFSA could be verified. There is no longer a maximum percentage of FAFSAs that can be verified. So that's just that real quick. Secondly, letting numbers speak for themselves. Morley and Amy kind of put this out there that there's been a serious spike recently, partially due to the Department of Ed's algorithm malfunction. And, there was a Washington Post article that got, a lot of attention where some four-year institutions reported having, a 3x multiple of their students being flagged. So that, anecdotes like that can really kind of point out the fact that this is an issue and it's getting worse. It's not getting better. In the meantime. And without stepping on Bill's portion too much, it's important to note that the numbers indicate clearly that there's a real issue here with regards to student outcomes. And more specifically, it's important to highlight that it's clearly disproportionately affecting low-income students, as 98% of those that are flagged are low-income students. And another nugget that I think influences or has a potential, I should say, to influence policymakers in this space is that, and this is something that Amy mentioned, that 1% of tax returns are audited, while on average 1/3 of FAFSAs are verified. So that's just something to kind of point to for a quick statistic comparison. And finally, on the numbers speaking for themselves, I would say it's important to indicate that one of our partners here in Washington and a member as well, the Institute for College Access and Success, or TCAS, did a study around this to see how many EFCs were changed as a result of the verification process. And 95% of aid packages are not altered as a result of verification. So that kind of calling into question, do we need to verify 1/3 of applications if only 5% are changed at the end of that process? Okay, and so finally, on this slide here, I have storytelling, and I think, like any other policy, if you're trying to influence someone's opinion on the matter, it's important to put a face to the policy and have the issue seem much more, more personal and relatable. And so we wrote a blog about a student named Eduardo, who moved here to the States from Guatemala in 2013. He just wrapped up high school and was flagged for verification, and the institution he wanted to attend required him to produce a tax transcript. But because his parents do not file taxes in the United States, they live back home in Guatemala, he had to go through this insane process where he had to get in touch with his parents who live on a farm in rural Guatemala, and they had to go into the city and create email accounts to sign off on the fact that they don't file taxes in the United States. And so kind of a universally applicable method here is to tell a story about how a student got hung up in the verification process, and maybe didn't enroll as a result, or maybe enrolled in the institution as Eduardo did without having a confirmed aid package. Which, to reference the same TCAS study that I did before, which is something that happens about 1 in 3 times. A student it gets flagged for verification ends up being forced to enroll in the institution without having a final dollar figure that will be contributed from the federal government to their college education. So Amy, if you could go ahead and go to the next slide. Okay. Oh, thank you. That's good. Perfect. Thank you. Okay. So to touch on this, on our website right now, decreasing verification is one of our federal policy priorities. So to just read the quick hit there, our stance is roughly half of all filers eligible for a Pell Grant are flagged for verification, which is an audit-like process to confirm information provided on the FAFSA. An estimated 22% of applicants abandon the aid process at this point, making it much less likely that they will enroll in college. By comparison, the IRS audits less than 1% of all filers. So that's our official stance at this point. And I say that to kind of bring out that we are reviewing what options we have from a specific policy perspective and what we can recommend to policymakers in the near future here. There's nothing set in stone, but things we are looking at do include the things that I mentioned today. That being, the 30% max cap that was lifted, or perhaps, does a 0.2% warrant verifying all of these low-income students, that being, it has to meet the threshold of 2.5% to be deemed an at-risk program, where in fiscal year 2011, we had just 2.7% of verifiers. So that all is to say, kind of everything is on the table on that front, I think. And we'll be thinking through that and having something more formal in the near future. And finally, just to echo what Morley said, use the DRT, use the DRT, use the DRT. In the same year that 2.7% of Pell payments were made improperly, just 20% of applicants were using the DRT. That number is at about 40% today. And so, as Morley said, you're much less likely to be flagged for verification, as the number one cause of for flagging an application for verification in fiscal year 2011, where that report was the manual and incorrect entry of tax data. That is to say, those that did not use the DRT were exponentially more likely to be flagged for verification and be brought down to this process. So the DRT is definitely something that we would be taking a look at from a policy perspective as well. And that is it for me.
All right, thank you so much, Jack. And Bill, I'll let you talk about this lovely infographic that NCAN has made. And folks, I also have this infographic attached in the handouts if you want to be able to take a look at this in more detail or use it later. And Bill, go ahead and take it away.
Well, thank you so much, Amy, and thank you all for joining us today. I'm really happy to be here. I'm here to chat about the data side of verification. So my colleagues, I think, have made a quite compelling case that verification is an obstacle for the students that we serve. We've heard that from members clearly and unequivocally over the years. And, you know, normally when we see obstacles like this, we try to quantify them so that we can make an even more compelling case to the public and policymakers that we need to make some reforms. Unfortunately, with FAFSA verification, it can be really hard to get concrete numbers about the effects of verification. So I'm going to walk through parts of the leaky FAFSA pipeline infographic here, but I want to talk a little bit about the source of the verification data in it first. So the U.S. Department of Education releases a federal Pell Grant program annual data report each year. And so we're able to pull a couple of data points out of this quite large report to get a little bit of insight about the effect of verification. So we know that in the 2015-16 program year, a large proportion of Pell eligible students were selected for verification. About 50% of Pell eligible applicants, or about 5.7 million students, were selected for verification. But of all the students who were selected for verification, 5.3 million students in 2014-15, about 98% of them were Pell eligible. So what we're making the case for here is that this is really a policy phenomenon that disproportionately impacts low-income students. And these are the students who have already had so many different obstacles to overcome to continue to be on a path toward college going. So I don't want to lose sight of that piece. I also want to just hammer home something that Amy talked about much earlier on in her presentation, which is that there really are way too many students eligible for the Pell Grant who ultimately do not receive it. So in 2015-16, there were about 11.4 million students who submitted FAFSAs and were eligible to receive a Pell Grant, and just 67% of those ultimately received a Pell Grant. And that figure is fairly consistent over time, with 30 to 33% of Pell eligible students not receiving a Pell Grant. So we're leaving way too much money on the table that could make college going possible for these students. So that's kind of the big picture here. So let's talk about specifically verification. So, you know, we strongly believe that verification is another reason that Pell eligible students don't receive Pell Grants, so that it is a significant contributor to that 30 to 33%. And so the Pell Grant Program annual report gave us some numbers that lend support to that idea. So we can look at the proportion of Pell eligible students who were selected and the overall Pell Grant receipt rate among Pell eligible students. And so we see that 78% of Pell eligible students who were not selected for verification later went on to receive a Pell Grant. But for Pell eligible students who were selected for verification, just 56% of them went on to receive a Pell Grant. So there's a 22 percentage point difference in Pell Grant receipt between those selected and those not selected for verification. And that's really troubling for us. Now, we know that there's something we kind of refer to as life happens melt for whatever reason. Students decide that they need to work, or they have family pressures, they have a lack of transportation, their priorities change. And so that's where that, that's why the 78%, that's why it's just 78% of Pell eligible students not selected for verification who go on to receive a Pell Grant. There's a 22% kind of life happens melt in there. But then what we're saying is that there's an additional 22 percentage point verification melt, it seems, for students who are Pell eligible and selected for verification. So we know that verification is not random and it works from a risk model. And so we don't know exactly, were students who were selected for verification less likely to actually matriculate for some other reason? For example, were they more likely to have a life happens kind of event that got in the way of their matriculation? Were they selected for verification for good reason? Were they actually ineligible for a Pell Grant, for example? Did their EFC change so much that it took them out of eligibility for a Pell Grant? Were these students less prepared for college in some way? We can't get at the answers to these questions out of the data that's available to us, but they could all plausibly impact the receipt of a Pell Grant. We don't know whether the characteristics of students selected for verification make them less likely to receive a Pell Grant regardless of verification, or whether verification decreases the likelihood of ultimately receiving a Pell Grant regardless of student characteristics. So there's some ambiguity here about which way the cause runs. But the bottom line here is that when we see a 22 percentage point difference between two groups of students, and what we see on its face is that some were selected for verification and some were not, that really tells us that a further examination of the effect of verification on Pell Grant receipt is warranted and necessary. Because when we think about this from a public policy standpoint, the Pell Grant is intended to improve college access and improve post-secondary outcomes for students. And I think it's a really reasonable question to ask about whether the policies and procedures that are in place are getting in the way of that policy intent. So, we're squeezing very hard on this annual Pell Grant program report to try to get a little bit of juice out of it so that we can get some insight into the effect of verification. But we need much more data and better data to examine the true effects here. So let me finally go back to this leaky FAFSA pipeline here, and I hope that it will be of value to those of you in the audience for making the case that even just in the FAFSA process, that there are so many places where a student can fall off the path of going to college. And again, when we're talking about low-income, first-generation students, many of them students of color, we're already talking about student populations that have significant obstacles to pursuing a post-secondary pathway. And so when we see just these obstacles here through the FAFSA process, where you might not even submit a FAFSA, and you might not do that because you don't know how to do that, or that you could do it. You might not know that there's money out there for you from the FAFSA. You might come from a family or have a personal belief where you're particularly debt averse. You don't want to take on loans. You think your credit is too low, that you're going to have to pass a credit check to get a Pell Grant. You may not, think that college is for you and may not decide that you want to pursue it. And then, of course, I don't think that there's a whole lot of folks out there who would, call a FAFSA a fun pastime. The form is quite complicated, right? So right off the top here, we're saying that 55% of low-income high school seniors will submit a FAFSA. Then we come down here and we start looking at the effects of verification, how many get pulled from verification melt, how many experience summer melt or that life happens melt that we're talking about. And we estimate that just 31% of low-income students eventually enroll using a Pell Grant out of a given class of low-income high school seniors. It's troubling. It's troubling, and I would say that it's unacceptable given the implications, not just for individuals and for families, but for economies and communities at the federal level. So I hope this infographic is helpful to you. I hope the work that we're doing around verification melt is helpful to you, and we certainly will continue to work at it to continue to squeeze more insights out of the available data and to press for more data so that we can get a better picture of the effect of FAFSA verification.
Thank you so much, Bill. Real quick before I get into the concluding part of the presentation, one of the questions that we had coming in was what year this data came from.
This is, I believe, 2015-16 for the class. So these are a couple of different data sources that are merged together, to be honest with you, given the different federal surveys and the years in which they're released. But I believe this is the class of 2016 low-income high school seniors.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, so I have a couple more slides on my side before we get to your questions. So give me a quick second. Okay, so FAFSA stories. Some of you in the question, and while I'm going over this, make sure that you're submitting your questions that you have so that we can answer those for you. So if you have stories about students who are having trouble completing the FAFSA, whether it's with the form itself, whether it's with verification, whether it's with correcting errors or correcting forms that are incomplete, make sure that you're sharing those with us, because that's a big part of our advocacy strategy, is to take the work that you guys are doing on the ground with students and to elevate it and to show the struggles that your students are having. So we definitely want to be sharing that. So if you are a Florida person, please contact me at abolick@floridacollegeaccess.org. And if you're from anywhere other than Florida, you can contact Jack Porter at porterj@collegeaccess.org. I will selfishly say, though, that if you are in the Southeast, feel free to share your stories with us as well, because we are trying to work with partners in some of our other states, so we might still be able to learn from you at Florida College Access, but I know that Jack at NCAN would love to get those stories for their work as well. Our next webinar is going to be taking place in September, and we're going to be talking about aligning business and education to create more student internships. My colleague Kathy McDonald will be on the call with someone from Career Services at USF named Lynn Chisholm, and she's been doing great work to get more students getting paid internships. And then finally, we now will open it up for your questions. So I have a couple of questions that have already come in, and let me see if I can take a look at those and get at them in a logical way. Okay, so this is a great one. Houston experienced a great deal of higher incomplete verification due to Hurricane Harvey and the issue of displacement and loss of paperwork. This also happened in Florida due to Hurricanes Irma and Maria, especially with a lot of students coming in from Puerto Rico. I know that in Florida, the IRS waived any of the fees on requesting new transcripts for that reason. So in Florida, it was free there was a disaster waiver for that. So I don't know if other states did anything similar to that. Morley, do you have anything to add there? Guess not.
Let me,
Okay.
I unmute there. Sorry, I
Yeah.
unmuted myself, Amy. I can't speak to the specific language, but yes, in places like that where there were disasters, but the Department of Education did issue relief guidance to institutions who were serving students affected by a lot of those natural disasters that occurred. And so while I can't give you the exact specifics, I can tell you that if you're working with a student who was affected by one of those natural disasters, they should have a conversation with the aid office to see what type of relief may be available to them in terms of, supplying documents that may have been destroyed, etc.
That's great. And then there was another question that I think is in your wheelhouse, Morley, which is how do service providers find out about a school's verification process? Is there anywhere on the website they would go for that? Would they have to talk to the financial aid folks?
You could probably do a little of both. In general, in high FAFSA filing season, if you probably go onto a university website and go into the financial aid section and kind of look for keywords, or key drop boxes that may have information on verification, you may be able to discern the process directly from the institution's website. And so that may and you're more likely to find on the website the information about how to supply the documents that might be required for verification. What you may not be as likely to find in that manner is the method in which they choose to notify students about verification. And so obviously sort of directly from the student may be the best way in terms of, if a student comes into your office and was selected for verification, and they can either show you the communication they received, or if they pull themselves up into, a student portal, at a particular university, and that you can kind of review with them the process or the instructions that they see online. And many times that way they're directed to a link to like download verification forms or things like that. So, working directly with the student may be the best way. There may be some stuff you can discern from the website, but it may not be everything that you would want to know.
That's great. Thank you so much. Before I get to the next question, there's been a couple of procedural questions. I forgot to mention this at the beginning of the presentation, and I profusely apologize. This session is being recorded, and I will be sharing the slides. You will be getting the recording and the slides within a week, if not within the next 72 hours. So don't worry about that. For the handouts that are attached, if you are viewing this on a desktop in your little GoToWebinar panel that's on the side, there should be a drop down that has the handouts. If you're having issues accessing those handouts, do not worry, I will attach them when I send out the slides and the recording later. And I'll also attach that Washington Post article that Jack mentioned. So keep sending in those questions. We got some good ones in the last minute or so we have here. Another question that someone asked was about the IRS data retrieval tool. And the question was, if a student submits a FAFSA without the data retrieval tool, but then updates it later with the data retrieval tool, will they still be flagged? So I want to clarify something really quick, and that's that students will not get flagged for submitting without the data retrieval tool. It's just that there is a higher probability that they'll be selected for verification based on the algorithm. And even students that use the data retrieval tool can still be selected for verification, even though it's a lower percentage, because that income is more likely to be verified. So if they go back and update with the DRT, then they'll probably drop down into a lower percentage of being less likely to be selected for verification, but there is nothing that a student can do when completing the FAFSA to ensure that they will not be selected.
That's correct. And then once they initially submit, if they're selected when they initially submit and they did not use the DRT, going back and providing the DRT, information may be one way that the college accepts verification of the income information, but once you're selected, you sort of cannot be unselected for verification. So that's why it's best to use the DRT tool up front when you're eligible, so to reduce the chances you're selected, because once you are, the college has no choice but to verify your information. They may select or allow you to go back in and update with IRS information. So.
All right, and with that, this has been a great session with all of you. I see a couple of more questions that came in at the end. I'll answer those privately. If you have further questions, feel free to email me at BOLICK316. I'm sorry, I'm giving you my personal email. Good God. BOLICK@floridacollegeaccess.org. And I'll be following up with the recording and with the slides. Thank you so much. And thank you, Bill, Jack, and Morley, for all of your help this afternoon.
You're welcome. Thanks for having us.
Thanks, everyone.